0 o'clock to 2 o'clock. Opening. The silence after the war. Narrator. The year is 1945. The guns have gone quiet across Europe. The concentration camps have been liberated. The photographs emerging from places like Dachau, Auschwitz, and Buchenwald are so horrifying that seasoned war correspondents cannot speak after seeing them. Nuremberg is being organized. Justice, the world is promised, will be served. But in the shadows of that same historical moment, a different kind of transaction is taking place, quietly, deliberately, hidden from the American public, from Congress, and from the survivors still counting their dead. United States intelligence officers are moving through the ruins of the Third Reich like shoppers at a clearance sale. They are not looking for war criminals to prosecute. They are looking for talent to recruit. Engineers who designed the V-2 rocket that rained down on London, chemists who developed nerve agents capable of killing thousands, physicians who performed experiments on living human beings without anesthesia, aviation specialists, ballistic experts, biological weapons researchers. They are being offered new names, new documents, new lives. The program that made this possible was called Operation Paperclip. And for decades, the United States government denied it existed at all. What you're about to hear is drawn entirely from declassified government documents, congressional investigations, and the testimonies of those who lived inside this secret. Nothing has been embellished. Nothing needs to be. The truth is already extraordinary. 2 o'clock to 4 o'clock. The Architecture of Deception. Narrator. To understand how Operation Paperclip worked, you need to understand the bureaucratic machinery that made it possible. In the final months of World War II, the United States military launched a classified mission called Operation Overcast. The stated goal was simple and seemingly defensible: capture German scientific expertise before the Soviet Union could. The Cold War had not officially begun, but the intelligence community could see it forming on the horizon like a storm front. Germany had achieved extraordinary things in weapons technology during the war. The V-2 ballistic missile was the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile. German jet aircraft had outpaced anything the Allies were flying. Advances in synthetic fuels, chemical weapons, and aviation medicine were decades ahead of American capabilities in some areas. The argument made inside classified briefings was pragmatic to the point of being chilling. If we do not take these men, the Soviets will. And so the decision was made. But there was a problem, a significant one. President Harry Truman had explicitly authorized the recruitment of German scientists only under one condition. They must have no active Nazi Party membership, no war crimes, no crimes against humanity. The directive was clear on paper. The problem was that virtually every significant German scientist worth recruiting had been a member of the Nazi Party. Many had not simply been passive members. They had been enthusiastic participants. Some had directly overseen the deaths of thousands. So the intelligence officers did something that should have ended careers and resulted in prosecutions. They altered the files. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, the JIOA, systematically reviewed the dossiers of scientists being considered for recruitment. When a file contained inconvenient details, party membership dates, references to slave labor, documented involvement in human experimentation, those details were removed, rewritten, or buried. New biographies were constructed. Histories were sanitized. In some cases, scientists who had personally supervised concentration camp labor were described in their new American files as having been, quote, not an ardent Nazi. Operation Overcast was eventually renamed Operation Paperclip. The name came from the paperclips agents used to attach the new sanitized biographies to the recruitment files. A small, mundane office supply, attached to one of the greatest moral compromises in American government history. 4 o'clock to 6 o'clock. Wernher von Braun, the face of the program. Narrator. No figure in Operation Paperclip is more studied, more celebrated, and more morally complicated than Wernher von Braun. By the time he arrived in the United States in 1945, von Braun was already legendary. He had been the driving intellectual force behind the V-2 rocket program, the world's most advanced weapons delivery system. He was charming, articulate, photogenic, and possessed of a genuine brilliance that those who worked with him described as almost unsettling in its clarity. He would go on to become the architect of the Saturn V rocket, the machine that carried Neil Armstrong to the moon. When Apollo 11 launched in July of 1969, von Braun stood at Cape Canaveral and wept. He was celebrated on the cover of Time magazine. He appeared on Walt Disney's television program to explain the future of space travel to American families gathered around their television sets. He was, by almost every public measure, an American hero. But here is what the public was not told. Von Braun had been a member of the Nazi SS, not a passive paperwork member. He held the rank of Sturmbannführer, equivalent to a major. He had personally visited the Mittelwerk facility, a vast underground weapons factory carved into the Harz Mountains using concentration camp labor from the nearby Dora camp. At Mittelwerk, prisoners, mostly Soviet POWs, French resistance fighters, and Jews, worked in conditions so brutal that more people died building the V-2 rocket than were ever killed by the V-2 rocket in combat. Estimates range from 10,000 to 20,000 deaths from starvation, disease, beatings, and summary executions. Workers were hanged from the factory's overhead cranes as punishment for suspected sabotage, their bodies left swinging as their fellow prisoners continued assembling rockets beneath them. Von Braun knew. Surviving prisoners testified to his presence. Post-war investigators found documentation linking him directly to requests for additional slave labor from the SS. His JIOA file, after sanitization, described him as a man who had been, quote, regarded as potentially dangerous by the Nazi Party. He was given American citizenship, a government salary, and eventually named director of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center. The poet Tom Lehrer captured the moral inversion in a darkly comic song, writing of von Braun, "Once the rockets are up, who cares where they come down?" "That's not my department," says Wernher von Braun. But this was not comedy. This was the operating philosophy of an entire government program. 6 o'clock to 8 o'clock. The Doctors, Human Experimentation and American Employment. Narrator, Wernher von Braun, for all the weight of his history, was not the darkest figure brought in under Operation Paperclip. That distinction belongs to the physicians. During World War II, Nazi doctors conducted experiments on concentration camp prisoners that are, even now, difficult to describe in precise language without causing visceral revulsion. They submerged living prisoners in ice water to study the limits of human cold tolerance for the Luftwaffe. They placed prisoners in decompression chambers and reduced atmospheric pressure until their lungs hemorrhaged. They infected prisoners with malaria, typhus, and tuberculosis. They surgically removed limbs and organs without anesthesia, then observed the process of infection and death. At the Nuremberg doctors' trial in 1946 and 1947, 23 German physicians were prosecuted. 7 were executed. The proceedings produced the Nuremberg Code, the foundation of modern medical ethics, establishing that voluntary informed consent is an absolute requirement for any human experimentation. And yet, quietly and simultaneously, the United States military was identifying German physicians with expertise in areas of direct military interest: aviation medicine, chemical weapons effects, biological agents, and evaluating them for recruitment. One of the most significant cases involves Dr. Hubertus Strughold, a specialist in aviation medicine who would later be called the father of space medicine in America. He appeared on the original JIOA recruitment list. Documents that emerged decades later linked him to conferences at which concentration camp experiments were discussed and their results shared among military physicians. His name appeared on documentation associated with the Dachau hypothermia experiments. Strughold spent decades working for the United States Air Force and NASA. He was awarded the Theodore C. Lyman Memorial Award. A library at the Brooks Air Force Base School of Aerospace Medicine was named after him. In 2006, following sustained pressure from Jewish organizations and investigative journalists, the library was renamed. His name was removed from the building, but by then Strughold had been dead for 24 years. He had lived out his full life in San Antonio, Texas as an American citizen, honored by the institutions he served. The pattern repeated itself across dozens of cases. Expertise was extracted, history was erased, and the Nuremberg Code, written in direct response to what these men had done, was quietly set aside when it became inconvenient. 8 o'clock to 10 o'clock. The Soviet Mirror and the Cold War Calculus. Narrator. To be fully honest about Operation Paperclip, one must acknowledge the context its architects used to justify it, and then interrogate whether that context was ever sufficient. The Soviet Union was, simultaneously, conducting its own version of the same operation.